Okay guys, so I want to talk to you today about one of my favorite books in the entire world, Saving Capitalism by Robert Reich. I've talked about Saving Capitalism once before, and the reason I want to bring it up again is because I think it's just more relevant than ever before, especially given the possibility that Bernie Sanders may be running again in 2020. Either Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, if you believe in that progressive populist message, this book, Saving Capitalism, is going to give you the full comprehensive economic foundation that you need to substantiate those claims when you tell people the economy is rigged and they don't believe you. On the very first page of this book, there's actually a quote from Bernie Sanders about the book. And Sanders says, if you want to understand why income and wealth inequality are the economic, political, and moral issues of our time, you must read this book. Alright, so before I jump into the book, quickly, who is Robert Reich? Reich is one of the most beloved professors at Berkeley. He's also a leading political economist. He also served in the Ford and the Carter administrations, and of course, he was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor back in the 90s. But on top of that, he's the co-founder of Inequality Media, and he's coming out with a new documentary, Saving Capitalism, based on this book. To fund the project, Reich took to Kickstarter and crowdfunded the campaign. He actually received more than $290,000 from over 3,700 people. If you pledged a certain amount to this Kickstarter campaign, you actually got sent a signed copy of this book, so there's a little autograph from Robert Reich. Pretty cool. And because this is one of my favorite books in the entire world, I'm super excited to see how it translates to film. So I implore you guys, when this doc drops, and it will drop soon, check it out, share it with your friends. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump into the book itself. The premise of the book is that there's this toxic myth baked into American society, and the myth tells us that you either have to be pro-government or pro-free market, right? So people on the left, they tend to be pro-government. They want more government. They want more public spending. Whereas people on the right, they tend to want less government. They tend to want more free market. The reality though is you can't even have a free market without having a government that creates rules and makes decisions. The problem is that in our country, those decisions and those rules are created behind closed doors by the very people and corporations that are benefiting most from those decisions. You may say, well, you can't influence the free market. You can't manipulate or dominate or rig the free market. It's free, right? Well, that's the whole myth. This market actually isn't free at all. It's made up of decisions around property, monopoly, bankruptcy, contract, and enforcement. These are all elements of the so-called free market that are actually created by people who want to win. But one of the biggest problems about this whole thing is that the wealthy and large corporations in America, they don't share the same interests as ordinary Americans. In fact, their priorities are totally different. It would be a totally different story entirely if these large multinational corporations and wealthy individuals who are disproportionately influencing the rules of the game, it would be a different story if they shared our interests, if they had things in common with us. But they care about different things. They want tax breaks for the wealthy. The American people don't want tax breaks for the wealthy. They don't want to raise the minimum wage. The American people need a living wage. I could go on and on and on about the differences between the ruling class and the actual American people. The ruling class in America does not represent the working class. And yet they do get to represent us in a legal and a political capacity, the more and more that their economic dominance allows them to influence the political system. What's happened in America is we've let big money infiltrate our political system. Throughout history, there have always been wealthy people trying to influence our political system. But after the disastrous Supreme Court decision of Citizens United, we now have virtually no checks against the influence that big money has. Large corporations and wealthy individuals are literally buying our politicians. They're in effect purchasing the policies that these politicians fight for. Meanwhile, the American people and the issues they care about, they get totally swept under the rug. Wall Street, large corporations, wealthy individuals, these are the people whose voices are heard in the American democracy. The American people could once depend on antitrust laws and trade unions to have countervailing power to fight back against some of these special interests. But constantly, trade unions are under attack, antitrust laws are withering, and these monopolies and the trust that we once used to bust are continuing to grow more powerful every day. The more economically powerful they become, the more politically powerful they become. So Reich talks about all these different industries in which monopolies have snuffed out the competition, and what you have to understand is when you have a monopoly, when you have like 1 or 2 or 3 corporations that dominate a particular market, what that means is there's very little room for any other company to come into that market and fight for market share. So what happens is there's no competition. When companies don't need to lower their prices to compete, consumers get ripped off, right? If you're the only company selling smartphones, you're gonna charge like $1,000 a smartphone, right? If there are like 1 million smartphone companies in the market and you're a smartphone company and you wanna compete, you're probably gonna have to lower your prices, which ends up helping consumers. So when there's more competition in the market, it's good for consumers. And when there's not a lot of competition in the market, it's bad for consumers. What's happening right now is there's almost no competition in the market because there are almost monopolies in every single industry. What's happening in big tech is all these big tech companies like IBM and Apple and Google, they're essentially hoarding different patents. They've essentially become patent trolls, and their goal is to collect as much intellectual property as possible to prevent competition. Now, the same thing's happening in big pharma. You have big pharma companies that patent a life-saving drug, and then you may have some startup out there that creates an even better drug or something that's very similar that can save millions of lives. And these guys, the startup, they're willing to charge like nothing because they want this drug to get out there and save lives. But what happens is these big pharma companies, they have patents on similar drugs, and they can actually prevent those smaller guys from bringing generic alternatives to market. So what happens is the profit motive and the greed of these big pharma companies is actually killing people in this country. It's also causing Americans to pay more money for pharmaceutical drugs than any people in the rest of the industrialized world. Americans are getting ripped off for pharmaceutical drugs, and a big reason is because the big pharma companies have a monopoly. Have you ever wondered why, even though America is the richest country in the history of the world, we have some of the slowest internet service and some of the most expensive internet service in the industrialized world? Like, what's up with that, right? Could it have anything to do with the fact that those telecom companies have a monopoly? There's no competition, so they have no incentive to lower their prices or to offer better services. President Woodrow Wilson probably wouldn't be surprised to find the United States in the state that it's in right now. He said, "I do not expect to see monopoly restrain itself. If there are men in this country big enough to own the government of the United States, they are going to own it." We see it right now in the Trump administration more than ever. All of the people who Trump appointed to lead these different regulatory agencies were actually sent there to destroy the regulatory agencies, to allow the so-called free market to do whatever the hell it wants. Because Trump doesn't want to hold the large corporations that these agencies are supposed to regulate accountable. He wants to let them do whatever the fuck they want. If you look at the FCC is supposed to regulate telecom. But what's actually happening is there's this massive revolving door between the telecom industry and that very agency that was meant to regulate it. So rather than having an objective body that's actually holding the industry accountable, what's happening is you have people who work in the industry who go over to the FCC and make decisions to help the industry. You also have people who are over at the FCC who want to help the industry so that once they leave the FCC, then they can get a top job at a place like Comcast. Going back to why I'm recommending Saving Capitalism in the first place, it's because I think if you want to see a progressive populist like Sanders or Warren or Reich for that matter in office, we need to understand that the inequality that these people are talking about, the economic inequality, the wealth inequality, this inequality is actually baked into our political and our economic systems. There's no getting around it so long as it's a part of us. As Reich makes the point, widening inequality has become baked into the building blocks of the free market itself. Reich tells us the idea of a free market, separate and distinct from government, has functioned as a useful cover for those who do not want the market mechanism fully exposed. So this is some really shady shit going on. Wall Street and the big banks are the perfect examples of how the wealthy and the powerful get disproportionate influence over the rules, and so they're able to take home millions and millions of dollars every single year, even though what they're risking is the American economy. Their recklessness and their greed back in 2008 led to the financial crisis that almost destroyed America and a lot of the world, and yet nobody went to jail. Meanwhile, you've got kids on the street who are getting pulled over for smoking a joint. These kids go to prison, and yet nobody from Lehman Brothers went to prison. While the rich and powerful become richer and more powerful, the poor and powerless become poorer and more vulnerable. What we need to do to fix this country and to save capitalism is to get big money out of politics, is to create antitrust laws that actually bust monopolies. We need to strengthen trade unions so that workers can organize and fight for things like a living wage. We just need to take back the power from the 1% who's creating those rules and who's making those decisions. And we need to do this so that we, the American people, can finally have representation in Washington and not just the billionaires.